How are you?
Hello.
So nice to see you.
This morning, the Prince of Wales showing raw emotion.
The discovery hit like a bolt of lightning. At 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, William was reviewing briefing papers for the next day's engagements when his private secretary entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately signalled crisis. The archivist at Balmoral Castle needed to speak with him directly, immediately. Nothing could be discussed over regular palace lines. Within minutes, William was connected via secure channels to Margaret Thornhill, the royal archivist who had spent 3 decades meticulously managing the family's historical collections. Her voice carried a tremor William had never heard before, and Margaret was not a woman easily unsettled. She had catalogued everything from medieval manuscripts to Queen Victoria's journals. She had handled correspondence detailing royal scandals across centuries and preserved documents most people would never know existed. Yet what she had uncovered that afternoon had shaken her so badly that she broke protocol and demanded immediate contact with the Prince of Wales. The discovery had happened almost by accident. Margaret had been working through boxes from a storage room that hadn't been properly inventoried since the 1950s. Most contained exactly what the cursory labels suggested: household accounts, staff records, mundane administrative papers from George VI's reign. But one box, marked simply Private 1940 to 1942, stored at the back of a locked cabinet, contained something entirely different. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a hand Margaret recognised instantly. The Duke of Windsor, former Edward VIII, the king who had abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. But these weren't the sanitised correspondence that existed in official archives. These were private letters, deliberately hidden, removed from the main collection, for reasons that became chillingly clear as Margaret began to read. The letters detailed Edward's conversations during the early years of World War II while in exile. Names leapt off the pages, sending chills down Margaret's spine. German officials, Nazi sympathisers, people negotiating a separate deal that could have handed Hitler control of continental Europe while potentially restoring Edward to the British throne under German influence. Technically, the correspondence wasn't treasonous. Edward was no longer king and owed no legal allegiance, but the level of collaboration and negotiation it revealed went far beyond mere Nazi sympathies. Historians had long suspected Edward hadn't just been photographed with German officials or made questionable statements. He had been actively involved in discussions about Britain's potential surrender, plans for his return to power, and arrangements for a post-war Europe under Nazi control. And according to the letters, he hadn't acted alone. Names repeated themselves: aristocrats, politicians, even members of the extended royal family, all sharing Edward's defeatist views and participating in these secretive conversations. Some of those names belonged to people whose descendants were still prominent in British public life. Margaret stopped reading after the first dozen letters, realising she had stumbled upon something that transcended normal archival protocol. This was no mere historical curiosity. It was potential dynamite, capable of destroying reputations, rewriting history books, and fundamentally shaking the monarchy if it became public. She had locked everything back in the cabinet, left the storage room, and immediately contacted William's office. As heir to the throne, he needed to know. And he needed to decide what to do with information that had been deliberately hidden for more than 80 years. William listened to Margaret's explanation with growing unease. He asked if she had told anyone else. She confirmed she had shown the letters to no one, mentioned their existence to no one, and had secured them immediately, contacting only William. He instructed her to maintain absolute silence and move the entire box to the castle's most secure vault. He would travel to Balmoral himself to examine the documents before deciding their fate. After the call ended, William sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he had just learned. The Duke of Windsor's Nazi sympathies had been documented for decades. Historians had written extensively about his political views, his meeting with Hitler in 1937, his problematic statements during the war. But this sounded entirely different. This wasn't just sympathy or poor judgment. This was active collaboration with people working against Britain during its darkest hour. If the letters contained what Margaret suggested, they would fundamentally alter historical understanding of the abdication crisis and the war years. They could reveal that the monarchy had harboured traitors, or at least those willing to contemplate treason. They could destroy the carefully maintained narrative that the royal family stood unified against Nazism, that Edward's abdication had been purely about marriage rather than politics. And depending on who else was named in the correspondence, the revelations could damage or even destroy living people whose only crime was being related to historical figures who had made catastrophic choices 80 years ago. William knew he could not make this decision alone. He needed to see the documents himself. He needed to understand their full scope and implications, quickly and quietly, before anyone else stumbled onto this discovery. The window for controlling this information was narrow and closing rapidly. Catherine was at Windsor with the children for their half-term break. William called her immediately, explaining only that something urgent had come up that required him to fly to Scotland tonight. He couldn't provide details over the phone, but promised he would explain everything when he returned. Catherine knew better than to press further. When William used that tone, it meant genuine crisis, not just another palace emergency. His security team was informed. He needed immediate transport to Balmoral. No explanation beyond urgent family matter was given. Accustomed to sudden changes in royal schedules, they arranged a helicopter to ferry him from Kensington to RAF Northolt, where a plane awaited to take him to Aberdeen. His private secretary assembled a minimal team. Just 2 aides with the highest security clearances, used to handling sensitive material. They would accompany William, examine the documents, and help assess the situation. No one else needed to know. Not yet. And possibly not ever, depending on the letter's contents. As William prepared to leave, he thought of his great-great-uncle Edward. The official history was familiar. Edward had fallen in love with an American divorcee, chosen personal happiness over duty, and lived the rest of his life in comfortable exile. He had been painted sometimes as a romantic, sometimes as irresponsible, but always with the assumption that love had been his greatest flaw. What if that narrative was a cover story? What if Edward had been removed not primarily because of Wallis Simpson, but because his political views and Nazi connections made him a wartime liability? What if the abdication had been less about love and more about preventing someone with fascist sympathies from remaining king while Hitler threatened invasion? Historians had debated these questions for decades, often dismissing them as conspiracy theories. Now, William was about to discover whether documentary evidence supported the darkest interpretation of events. The helicopter lifted off Kensington just after 9, carrying him toward whatever devastating truth waited in a locked cabinet at Balmoral. The flight to Northolt took 20 minutes, the plane to Aberdeen another 90. Throughout the journey, William sat in silence, contemplating what he might find and what he would do. Some discoveries, once found, couldn't be undiscovered. Some truths, once known, changed everything. William understood that in a few hours he would know something about his family's history that might burden him for the rest of his life. A secret, so toxic it had been hidden for 8 decades, was now suddenly exposed by an archivist's routine inventory work. The plane began its descent into Aberdeen just before midnight. A car waited to drive him the 50 miles through the dark Scottish countryside to Balmoral, and at the castle, in a locked vault, a box of letters waited to reveal whether the monarchy William would someday inherit was built on a foundation more compromised than anyone had dared admit. The journey, the drive from Aberdeen to Balmoral in darkness, felt longer than its actual 90-minute duration. William sat in the back of the Range Rover, watching the Scottish Highlands pass in shadow, his mind cycling through scenarios of what he might find. His 2 aides maintained respectful silence. They knew only that an urgent archival matter required the Prince of Wales's immediate attention. The specifics would be revealed once they reached the castle. Balmoral at midnight was both familiar and unsettling. William had spent countless holidays here and knew every room and corridor, associating the estate with family gatherings, summer relaxation, and childhood memories. But approaching it now on a secret midnight mission to examine potentially explosive historical documents transformed the castle entirely. It became a repository of hidden truths, a place where uncomfortable secrets had been locked away for generations, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to uncover them. Margaret Thornhill was waiting at the main entrance, looking both exhausted and tense, her eyes betraying the weight of what she'd discovered. She'd spent the past 5 hours since their call reviewing the documents more thoroughly, and every page had deepened her concern. She led William and his aide to the castle's secure archive room. a climate-controlled space in the basement where the most sensitive materials were stored. The box sat on an examination table, unassuming in appearance, standard archival storage, roughly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep. Nothing about its exterior hinted at the historical bombshell it contained. Margaret had left it exactly as she had found it, removing nothing except to relocate it from the unlocked storage room to this secure space. William approached the table slowly, aware that once he looked inside, he could never unknow what he learned. Margaret offered context before he opened it. The box had been mislabeled or deliberately disguised. The exterior marking read simply, Private 1940 to 1942, offering no clue of authorship or content. It had been buried behind other boxes, accessible only after moving several containers. Margaret had found it purely by conducting the first comprehensive reorganization of that storage area in 70 years. Inside, the letters were organized chronologically, spanning June 1940 through November 1942. Most were from Edward, with some copies of replies included. They had apparently been preserved by someone who recognized both their historical significance and their potential danger. Destroying them might have been the sensible choice. Yet someone had hidden them, perhaps believing they might need to be revealed someday, or perhaps unable to destroy correspondence from a former king, no matter its content. William put on the cotton gloves archivists used for fragile documents and carefully removed the first letter from the box. It was dated June 20th, 1940, just days after France surrendered to Germany. Edward was writing from Lisbon, where he and Wallace had fled ahead of the German advance. The recipient was a German diplomat. The tone was casual, almost friendly, despite Britain and Germany being at war. Edward expressed his belief that continued fighting was pointless, that Britain couldn't possibly win against German military superiority. Sensible people on both sides, he argued, should be working toward negotiated peace. He suggested the British government, Churchill's government, was too inflexible, too wedded to outdated notions of honour and resistance. Different leadership might see Britain's best interests differently. The implications were chilling. Even in this first letter, Edward suggested to a German official that Churchill's government should be replaced with one more willing to negotiate surrender, positioning himself as someone who might provide alternative leadership if circumstances changed. William read 3 more letters in rapid succession, each more disturbing than the last. In July 1940, Edward wrote about conversations with intermediaries concerning potential peace terms. By August, he was discussing the British Empire's governance, arrangements for a negotiated settlement, and the possibility of his return to Britain in some capacity if peace were secured. Legally, this wasn't treason. Edward was no longer king, technically owed no loyalty, but morally and politically, it was devastating. Here was a former monarch actively negotiating with enemy representatives while Britain fought desperately for survival. While civilians endured the Blitz and the RAF battled in the skies during the Battle of Britain, Edward was in Lisbon discussing surrender terms. William's aides read over his shoulder, expressions growing grimmer with every letter. This wasn't historical nuance. It was clear evidence of collaboration. The letters revealed Edward not merely as sympathetic to Nazi Germany, but as actively working to undermine British resistance. Yet the most explosive aspect wasn't Edward's actions. It was the other names appearing in the correspondence. Edward wasn't acting alone. British aristocrats, politicians who preferred accommodation with Hitler, and even family members appeared repeatedly. One letter from October 1940 mentioned conversations Edward had with his brother, George, Duke of Kent, King George VI's younger brother. George was described as sympathetic to Edward's defeatist views, believing Britain might need to seek terms if America didn't enter the war. The letter suggested George had spoken with others in the family about potentially pressuring King George VI to reconsider his support for Churchill's government. The Duke of Kent had died in a 1942 plane crash, lionized as a war hero. His reputation had remained untarnished for 8 decades. This letter suggested his wartime stance might have been more complicated. He had at least considered supporting his elder brother's position. Other names appeared too. Aristocrats whose descendants still held prominence in British society, with family ties to the House of Lords and connections through marriage to the current royal family. Publication of these letters wouldn't just rewrite history, it would create contemporary scandals. Living people might have to answer for ancestors' choices. It would raise questions about whether these defeatist attitudes had persisted through generations. William read for over 2 hours, moving chronologically through all 57 letters spanning 2.5 years, each revealing more moral and political compromise than the last. The correspondence ended abruptly in November 1942, with no explanation why Edward had stopped saving copies or why someone had collected this particular set while possibly destroying others. The final letter, dated November 15, 1942, was the most chilling. It was from Edward to an intermediary facilitating communications with German officials. He expressed frustration that his efforts had achieved nothing, the war continuing without progress toward the peace he sought. Then he wrote a line that sent a cold shiver down William's spine. Perhaps when this is over, history will recognise who truly served Britain's interests and who sacrificed the nation to Churchill's vanity. Edward apparently believed, or wanted to believe, he had been trying to save Britain while Churchill led it to destruction. The historical irony was crushing. Churchill had saved Britain. Edward's peace efforts would have meant subjugation to Nazi Germany. Yet even in 1942, as the tide turned, Edward remained convinced he was right, and Churchill wrong. William closed the final letter and sat back, absorbing the weight of what he had read. His aides remained silent, understanding they had just witnessed historical revelations capable of rewriting World War II narratives and potentially tarnishing the carefully maintained image of the monarchy. Margaret finally asked the question everyone was thinking: what should be done with these documents? They had been hidden for over 80 years for obvious reasons. Should they remain hidden, destroyed to protect reputations, preserved but classified, or made public for historians to incorporate into the record? William had no immediate answer. The archivist in him believed documents should be preserved and eventually accessible. The royal in him knew publication would cause enormous controversy and potential damage. The moral person in him understood that truth mattered, even when inconvenient. He needed time to think, consult, and weigh implications beyond the immediate shock. He instructed Margaret to keep the documents in the secure vault, access restricted to just her and him. No one else was to know they existed, not yet. He would take photographs of key documents back to London for analysis and consultation with trusted advisors, but the originals would remain at Balmoral, locked away as they had been for 8 decades. As dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands, William prepared for the return journey to London. He had flown to Scotland in crisis mode, unsure what he might find. He was leaving with devastating knowledge. Documentary proof that his great-great-uncle had collaborated with Nazi Germany, that other family members had at least considered supporting that collaboration, and that the abdication crisis and war years were more morally compromised than official histories. William admitted to himself that the weight of this knowledge would travel back with him to London, where he would have to decide whether some truths were too destructive to be revealed, or whether historical honesty demanded exposure regardless of consequence. The consultation began the following day. William returned to Kensington Palace just before noon on Wednesday, having barely slept during the flight back from Aberdeen. Catherine was waiting in their private sitting room, the children sent off to their lessons, leaving her alone with her thoughts and worry. She had spent the night fretting over William's sudden departure and cryptic explanation, understanding instinctively that it suggested genuine crisis rather than routine emergency. William showed her selected photographs of the letters on his secured tablet, watching her expression shift, curiosity, shock, and finally a look approaching horror, as she absorbed Edward's casual discussions of Britain's surrender. Catherine had studied history at St Andrews and knew the standard narratives of the abdication and war years, but seeing documentary evidence that contradicted every lesson she had been taught was fundamentally unsettling. Her first question was practical. Who else knew? William confirmed that only Margaret, the archivist, his 2 aides, and now Catherine herself had seen the documents or knew of their existence. The circle had been deliberately small. Every additional person brought a new risk of exposure, intentional or accidental. Catherine's strategic mind immediately grasped the implications. If these letters became public, the monarchy would face sustained criticism, not only about Edward's wartime loyalties, but about whether the institution had genuinely opposed Nazism or had harboured defeatists and collaborators. Edward's sympathies would draw condemnation, but far more damaging was the revelation that he was not alone. Other royals and aristocrats had shared his views, The Duke of Kent's apparent involvement was particularly explosive. Celebrated as a war hero, commemorated with buildings and foundations bearing his name, revered for generations, he now appeared to have at least entertained defeatist ideas. Revealing this would tarnish his legacy and reverberate through his descendants, whose pride in his name remained unshaken until now. Suppressing the documents carried risks too. If rediscovered by others, or if William's knowledge of them leaked later, accusations of a cover-up would devastate public trust. The monarchy would be accused of protecting treasonous ancestors, hiding historical truths to preserve reputations. The damage from such exposure might even exceed that from honest disclosure. William had wrestled with this calculation throughout the return flight, understanding there was no safe path, only a choice between different kinds of damage. He decided to consult the one person whose judgment he trusted absolutely on matters of institutional preservation: his father, King Charles. Despite their personal complexities, Charles had spent decades thinking deeply about the survival and evolution of the monarchy. He understood the delicate balance between historical honesty and institutional protection. The meeting was arranged that evening at Clarence House. William brought the tablet containing photographs of the letters, having told Charles only that an urgent historical matter required immediate private discussion. Charles cleared his schedule and ensured complete privacy. No staff, no advisors, just father and son confronting a crisis that spanned generations. Charles read through the selected letters with characteristic thoughtfulness, occasionally pausing to reread passages or making quiet observations. His face betrayed no shock at 76 years old, having weathered decades of royal scandals. Little surprised him, but William could see the calculation happening, the weighing of implications and options unfolding in real time. When Charles finished, his first observation was characteristically nuanced. The letters were unquestionably damaging, but context mattered. Edward had written them between 1940 and 1942, when Britain's situation appeared desperate to many intelligent observers. Belief in negotiated peace, even with the enemy, wasn't inherently treasonous. It was defeatist, yes, but perhaps motivated by perceived pragmatism rather than malice. William countered that motivation didn't change the fundamental fact. Edward had been working with enemy representatives to undermine his own nation's war effort. The Duke of Kent and others named had at least entertained collaboration. These weren't pessimistic assessments, they were active efforts to facilitate British surrender. Charles acknowledged this, but raised historical precedent. Churchill's government had been aware of Edward's communications and shipped him to the Bahamas as governor, far from Europe, to neutralize potential disruption. The government had considered treason charges, but decided that prosecuting a former king would cause greater damage than leaving the matter contained. The letter's continued secrecy suggested deliberate preservation for leverage, potential evidence of a problem yet kept hidden to avoid scandal. That decision had worked for 80 years. Now, however, 21st century circumstances demanded reconsideration. Charles suggested consulting the cabinet secretary, the government's most senior civil servant, used to handling classified material and constitutional crises. William resisted. Every person brought into the circle increased exposure risk. Government officials, once aware, could inadvertently leak information or see the letters referenced in memoirs or freedom of information requests. They debated options through the evening: destroy the documents entirely and falsify history, keep them hidden indefinitely, or make them public, historically honest, but institutionally destructive. No clear answer emerged. Charles finally proposed a compromise: consult one trusted historian to evaluate the letters' authenticity and historical significance without revealing their provenance or that the royal family was involved. Present the documents as recently discovered letters with unclear origins, then decide based on informed assessment rather than fearful speculation. William saw merit in this approach but worried about secrecy. Any historian would recognize Edward's handwriting and deduce the royal archives as the source, spreading word rapidly. Catherine, listening intently, suggested a modification. Instead of a historian, why not show the letters to the Imperial War Museum's director? The museum routinely handles sensitive wartime documents, with protocols for assessing whether materials should be made public or remain classified for national security reasons. Charles appreciated the logic, but noted that involving any institution created a permanent record. The director's evaluation would be logged, filed, and potentially subject to disclosure, expanding the circle beyond the few currently aware. The meeting ended without resolution. William returned to Kensington, promising to weigh all options carefully before deciding. Charles emphasised that whatever choice was made needed to be defensible, historically and institutionally. Protecting the family's reputation alone would be morally indefensible, yet revealing the letters could cause immense damage to living people whose only fault was ancestral connection. That night, William lay awake thinking of his great-great-uncle Edward. History had been kind to him. The romantic who gave up a throne for love lived in comfortable exile, portrayed as more foolish than malicious. That narrative, familiar and mostly harmless, was about to be obliterated. The letters would redefine Edward as a Nazi collaborator, someone who had actively worked against Britain during its darkest hour. His abdication might have been necessary not just personally, but politically, given his incompatible views with Britain's survival. The Duke of Kent, William's great-great-uncle, would be tainted by association. Aristocrats named in the correspondence would face exposure. Families' reputations, painstakingly built over generations, could crumble. All because an archivist had done her job. Inventorying a storage room untouched for 70 years, she had unearthed a deliberately hidden box that could not be ignored. Sometimes, William reflected, the past was supposed to remain buried, but historical truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it is concealed. And now, that truth rested in his hands, photographed on a secured tablet, locked in a vault at Balmoral, demanding a decision that would define his relationship with history, honesty, and the institution he would someday lead. The decision William had hoped to make privately became complicated when, 3 days after his return from Balmoral, a reporter from The Guardian called Kensington Palace's press office with a peculiar inquiry. Had the Prince of Wales recently travelled to Scotland on urgent business? Had this trip involved accessing the royal archives? Was there any connection between this visit and rumours of previously unknown documents related to World War II? The questions were vague enough to suggest that the reporter had fragments of information rather than a complete story. But clearly, someone had noticed, talked, or pieced together clues. William's supposedly secret midnight flight to Balmoral hadn't been as invisible as he'd hoped. His communications director fielded the call with standard deflections. The Prince of Wales's private schedule was not to be commented upon. No information about the royal archives could be confirmed or denied. The palace would respond to formal inquiries through proper channels, but internally, alarm bells were ringing. William immediately called Margaret at Balmoral. Had she mentioned the discovery to anyone? She insisted she had not. The only people aware were William, his 2 aides, and whoever he had subsequently told. Margaret had followed his instructions exactly, keeping the documents secured and discussing them with no one. But palace security and staff had noted William Sutton's arrival and departure. Flight logs and helicopter manifests existed. Various staff members had observed fragments of the activity. Even if no one saw the full picture, someone had apparently assembled enough fragments to make educated guesses, and those guesses had made their way to a reporter. The Guardian reporter was not alone. Over the next 48 hours, 3 other journalists from different outlets called with similar inquiries, each approaching from a slightly different angle, but all circled the same basic story. William had flown secretly to Scotland to handle something in the archives, something significant enough to require immediate personal attention. The story was becoming self-fulfilling. Even without direct leaks, the very act of inquiries was generating more inquiries. Journalists were investigating why William had gone to Balmoral, and that investigation was now drawing attention to what he had been trying to keep hidden. William convened an emergency meeting with his senior advisors at Kensington Palace. Present were his private secretary, communications director, the 2 aides who had accompanied him to Scotland, and Catherine. Notably absent was King Charles. William wanted to manage this himself, without pulling his father deeper into the crisis. The consensus was grim. The story was going to break. Too many people had noticed fragments. The Guardian was clearly preparing an article, likely for weekend publication, and other outlets would surely follow. Once the first story ran, the palace could deny or deflect only briefly. The time for absolute secrecy had passed. The question was no longer whether the story would become public, but what version the palace wanted to present. They could stay silent, letting journalists piece together fragmented narratives, likely resulting in speculation and inaccuracy, or they could get ahead of it, choosing controlled disclosure before the press forced chaotic revelation. William's communications director outlined the options. 1. Controlled disclosure, a statement confirming historical documents had been discovered during routine archival work at Balmoral, acknowledging that Prince William had reviewed them personally due to their sensitive nature, but declining to specify contents while historical evaluation continued. This approach would confirm journalists' suspicions while maintaining some narrative control. 2. A more transparent approach. Release the existence of the letters and a general description of their content, explaining the decision-making process and framing it as responsible historical stewardship rather than attempted cover-up. Allow historians and the public to debate how they should be handled, rather than letting the palace make a unilateral choice. William struggled with both. The first option could look like confirmation the palace had something to hide. Why refuse to specify unless it was damaging? The second risked voluntarily creating the scandal he had tried to prevent. Catherine offered a third option, one no one had yet voiced. What if they simply released the letters entirely, all at once, with full transparency? Acknowledge their existence and content, express appropriate regret for what they revealed, but demonstrate complete openness rather than appearing to hide or minimize uncomfortable truths. The suggestion stunned the room. William's private secretary immediately outlined the risks: uncontrolled damage to the monarchy's reputation, ammunition for Republican movements, devastating impact on living descendants of those named in the letters, and complete loss of control over how the story would be framed. Yet Catherine's logic was compelling. Every attempt to suppress historically significant information eventually failed, often making eventual revelation worse. The letters would come to light, whether through leaks, FOI requests, or investigative journalism. Better to release them voluntarily on the palace's terms than face hostile reporting that would shape the story independently. William saw merit in her argument, but still worried about the immediate impact. The letters revealed his great-great-uncle as a Nazi collaborator, implicated the Duke of Kent, and suggested the royal family had been more divided in opposing Hitler than history acknowledged. Releasing this information would dominate news cycles for weeks, require explanation and apology, and force the monarchy to confront ugly aspects of its past. The alternative, continued secrecy, limited disclosure, or piecemeal releases, felt increasingly untenable. The Guardian was preparing to break the story regardless, and other journalists were independently pursuing it. Attempts to contain it now would likely fail, leaving the palace appearing guilty of cover-up. The debate continued through the afternoon and evening. William's advisers remained split between cautious, limited disclosure and Catherine's radical transparency. No one was comfortable. Every option was fraught with difficulty. That evening, William called his father again, updating him on press inquiries and internal discussions. Charles's reaction was measured. The monarchy had survived worse. Wallis Simpson, Diana's death, Andrew's scandals. Each had seemed potentially fatal at the time, but had been weathered through transparency, adaptation, and patience. Charles feared not just the letter's content, but the perception of concealment. The monarchy's survival depended on public belief in its honesty, that it acknowledged rather than denied its failings. If William tried to suppress the letters and was exposed, the damage would be catastrophic. Charles advised erring on the side of transparency. Release the letters with appropriate context, express regret, and trust that the British public could distinguish historical failings from contemporary institutions. Edward had been dead for over 50 years. The Duke of Kent had died in 1942. Those named in the letters were long gone. Their political views, discredited by history, were embarrassing but not existentially threatening. William absorbed his father's counsel but remained uncertain. The decision felt enormous. Whether to expose family secrets hidden for 8 decades, knowing exposure would cause pain to living relatives and damage historical narratives, weighed heavily. External events were now forcing the decision. By Friday evening, The Guardian informed the palace that it would publish a story on Sunday about William's secret flight to Balmoral and the archival discoveries relating to World War II. The palace had the opportunity to comment before publication. The story would break whether William wanted it or not. The question was no longer if the letters would become public, but how. William realized with a sense of inevitability that he needed to choose transparency rather than have it forced upon him by journalists. He authorized his communications director to prepare a full statement for Saturday morning, beating The Guardian's Sunday publication. The statement would acknowledge the letters' discovery, outline their content honestly, and announce that they would be made available to historians and eventually to the public after proper conservation and authentication. After deliberation, the decision was made. The devastating discovery he had flown to Scotland to investigate would now become public knowledge, and the monarchy would have to confront the uncomfortable truth that even during its finest hour, World War II, it had harboured voices advocating surrender and collaboration. The reckoning, the statement released from Kensington Palace at 8 o'clock Saturday morning, was unprecedented in its candour rather than the usual, careful palace language that obscured as much as it revealed. This statement was direct and detailed. It confirmed that during routine archival work at Balmoral, previously unknown correspondence from Edward, Duke of Windsor, had been discovered. The letters revealed that the former king had engaged in communications with German officials and intermediaries about potential negotiated peace while Britain was fighting for survival. The letters showed Edward held defeatist views, believed British resistance was futile, and apparently worked to facilitate discussions about surrender terms. The statement acknowledged that other names appeared in the correspondence, including members of the royal family and aristocracy. It expressed profound regret that these individuals had contemplated positions that history had proven catastrophically wrong. It noted that Churchill's government had apparently been aware of Edward's problematic communications, which explained why he had been sent to the Bahamas, effectively exiled to prevent further damage. Most significantly, the statement announced that the complete letters would be digitized and made available to accredited historians immediately, with public access to follow after proper conservation, ensuring transparency while preserving historical integrity. The palace was not attempting to suppress or selectively release this information. It was being transparent about uncomfortable historical truths. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News organizations around the globe led with the story. Royal Archives reveal Edward VIII's Nazi collaboration ran the Times headline, "Duke of Windsor worked for British defeat," declared The Guardian. International media picked it up within hours, translating the story into dozens of languages. Yet the response was not uniformly negative toward the current royal family. Many commentators praised William for releasing the information rather than hiding it. Historians lauded the transparency, noting this was precisely how archives should operate, preserving historical truth even when inconvenient or embarrassing. The most critical responses focused on Edward himself and those named in the letters. The Duke of Windsor's reputation, already complicated, was now permanently tarnished. The romantic narrative of the king who gave up everything for love was replaced by the darker truth. He had been a Nazi sympathizer who actively worked against his own nation during wartime. Historians began analyzing the letters within hours of their digital release. A scholarly consensus quickly formed. The letters confirmed what many had suspected but could not prove. Edward had been more than merely sympathetic to Nazi Germany. He had actively undermined British resistance. The revelation about the Duke of Kent was more surprising, though not entirely shocking given what was already known about aristocratic defeatism in 1940. Several academic institutions announced plans for conferences to examine the letters' historical significance. Publishers contacted historians about new book projects, analysing the correspondence and its implications. Rather than being buried, the letters became central to a scholarly reassessment of the abdication crisis and Britain's wartime politics. Republican movements attempted to use the revelation as ammunition, arguing that it proved the monarchy's fundamental unfitness for its constitutional role. Yet the argument gained little traction. Most citizens seemed able to distinguish between the failings of historical figures and the values of the contemporary institution. The current royal family could not be held responsible for what Edward had done 80 years ago, particularly when they had chosen transparency over concealment. A month after the discovery, William returned to Balmoral to meet with Margaret Thornhill, the archivist whose routine inventory work had triggered the entire crisis. She had spent the intervening weeks managing unprecedented attention from historians seeking access, journalists requesting interviews, and palace security reviewing protocols to ensure no other explosive documents were hidden in unexplored archives. William thanked her for her discretion in the initial handling of the discovery. If Margaret had casually shown the letters to colleagues or mentioned them in passing, the information could have leaked in uncontrolled ways. Her immediate recognition of the document's sensitivity and her decision to contact William directly had given the palace time to make thoughtful, controlled decisions about disclosure. Margaret asked whether William regretted her discovery. If she hadn't been reorganizing that storage room, the letters might have remained hidden for another 80 years, or forever. Would it have been better if they had never been found? William considered the question carefully. The discovery had been painful, created difficulties, and damaged historical reputations, but hiding historical truth was ultimately corrosive. The documents revealed uncomfortable facts about the monarchy's wartime history, yet they also demonstrated that the institution had ultimately acted correctly by marginalizing Edward and supporting Churchill. Had the letters remained hidden and been discovered later by hostile journalists or Republican activists, the damage could have been far worse. By taking control of the narrative and releasing them voluntarily, the palace had turned a potential scandal into a demonstration of institutional integrity. Prince William's secret flight to Scotland following the discovery of explosive wartime letters could have become an institutional catastrophe. Instead, his decision to release the documents revealing Edward VIII's Nazi collaboration and family complicity demonstrated unprecedented transparency, confronting uncomfortable historical truths rather than hiding them. William showed that a modern monarchy survives through honesty, accountability, and moral courage. Some secrets demand exposure. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more updates and behind-the-scenes historical revelations.